welcome to the Labor Force Podcast. Stories of the working class in a time of renewed labor militancy and awareness that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strugan, proud member of New York State United Teachers. First up, Trump's State of the Union. Not going to unpack the whole thing. Let's just get into retirement and healthcare with the orange man's populist panache, then the tariff situation.
Since I took office, the typical 401k balance is up by at least $30,000. That's a lot of money. We have millions and millions of people, because the stock market has done so well, setting all those records, your 401ks are way up. Yet half of all of working Americans still do not have access to a retirement plan with matching contributions from an employer. To remedy this gross disparity, I'm announcing that next year my administration will give these often forgotten American workers, great people, the people that built our country, access to the same type of retirement plan offered to every federal worker. We will match your contribution with up to $1,000 each year. As we ensure that all Americans can profit from a rising stock market, let's also ensure that members of Congress cannot corruptly profit from using insider information. They stood up for that. I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Did Nancy Pelosi stand up if she's here? Doubt it. Pass the Stop Insider Trading Act without delay.
Yeah, there's that populist lean that sometimes comes out in words, but check back in 6 months or even a year, and that act will damn sure not have been passed. Empty bluster from the ultimate corrupter himself, as usual. And here's the problem with celebrating a booming stock market as proof that workers are thriving. The potential AI bubble makes clear that much of today's market surge is being driven not by broadly shared economic strength, but by massive speculative investment concentrated in a handful of tech and AI firms. When retirement security is tied almost entirely to stock valuations inflated by hype, workers aren't gaining stability, they're being exposed to risk they don't control. Yes, some 401k balances may be temporarily higher, but that wealth exists on paper and depends on markets continuing to rise. If the AI investment boom cools, as past tech bubbles have, those same retirement accounts can lose value just as quickly. Workers remember this from the dot-com crash and the 2008 financial crisis, when retirement savings evaporated, while executives and investors recovered far faster than ordinary employees. The deeper contradiction is already acknowledged in the statement itself. Half of working Americans still lack access to employer-matched retirement plans at all. A rising stock market primarily benefits people who already have stable employment, disposable income to invest, and access to retirement benefits. Millions of low-wage, gig, and service workers are effectively locked out, meaning market gains widen inequality rather than solve it. Matching contributions for uncovered workers would help, but framing retirement security as profiting from a rising stock market reinforces the core problem. Retirement in the U.S. increasingly depends on financial markets instead of guaranteed income, shifting responsibility and risk from employers and government onto individual workers. If today's market gains are tied to an overheated AI investment cycle, then basing national retirement policy on those gains amounts to building workers' futures on speculation. A truly secure retirement system wouldn't depend on whether Wall Street is setting records this quarter. It would ensure stability regardless of bubbles, corrections, or hype cycles, because workers need predictable security, not exposure to the next market swing.
I'm also confronting one of the biggest ripoffs of our times, the crushing cost of health care caused by you. Since the passage of the Unaffordable Care Act, sometimes referred to as Obamacare, big insurance companies have gotten rich. It was meant for the insurance companies, not for the people. With our government giving them hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year, as their stock prices soared 1,000, 1,200, 1,400, and even 1,700%, like nothing else. That's why I introduced the great health care plan. I want to stop all payments to big insurance companies and instead give that money directly to the people so they can buy their own health care, which will be better health care at a much lower cost. In addition, my plan requires maximum price transparency. That's a big deal. Sounds so simple, so big. And I did that in my first term, and the Democrats immediately terminated it with full knowledge that they were doing a very bad thing for the people. Costs were going to go way up, and that's what happened, and now I'm bringing them way down on health care and everything else. I'm also ending the wildly inflated cost of prescription drugs like has never happened before. Other presidents tried to do it, but they never could. They tried. Most didn't try, actually. But they tried. They said they tried. They couldn't do it. They didn't even come close. They were all talk and no action, but I got it done. Under my just enacted most favored nation agreements, Americans who have for decades paid by far the highest prices of any nation anywhere in the world for prescription drugs will now pay the lowest price anywhere in the world for drugs. Anywhere, the lowest price.
So if healthcare really is one of the biggest ripoffs of our time, then the obvious question isn't how do we shop better inside the same system, it's why the U.S. still relies on private insurance corporations as middlemen at all. The core economic reality is simple. America already spends more public money per person on healthcare than countries with universal systems, yet millions remain uninsured or underinsured. The problem isn't the government spends too much, it's that public dollars are routed through profit-driven insurers whose business model depends on restricting care, narrowing networks, and shifting costs onto patients through deductibles and copays. So giving people cash to buy their own health care doesn't eliminate that system, it deepens it. Individual purchasing power cannot compete with consolidated hospital chains, pharmaceutical giants, and national insurance conglomerates. That approach turns sick people into consumers navigating one of the most complex markets on earth while they're at their most vulnerable. Healthcare stops being a public good and becomes a financial gamble. Universal healthcare flips that equation. Instead of subsidizing private insurers or asking individuals to bargain alone, a universal system pools risk across the entire population, the same economic principle that already makes Medicare popular and efficient. Administrative costs drop, bargaining power rises, and prices fall because the country negotiates as one large purchaser rather than millions of fragmented buyers. The prescription drug issue actually proves the point. Americans pay the highest drug prices in the world precisely because other wealthy nations use national health systems to negotiate or set prices directly. Lower drug costs don't come from transparency slogans or temporary pricing rules. They come from public leverage created by universal coverage. Economic populism in healthcare isn't about rearranging subsidies within a privatized marketplace. It's about removing profit extraction from essential care altogether. Every other advanced economy guarantees coverage, spends less overall, and delivers comparable or better outcomes because healthcare is treated as infrastructure, like roads, schools, or fire protection, not a consumer luxury. The real cure for America's healthcare disparities isn't asking people to shop harder. It's ensuring that access to doctors, hospitals, and medicine is guaranteed as a right, financed publicly, and delivered without the constant pressure of shareholder profits.
I used these tariffs, took in hundreds of billions of dollars to make great deals for our country, both economically and on a national security basis. Everything was working well. Countries that were ripping us off for decades are now paying us hundreds of billions of dollars. They were ripping us so badly, you all know that. Everybody knows it. Even the Democrats know it. They just don't want to say it. And yet these countries are now happy And so are we. We made deals. The deals are all done. And they're happy. They're not making money like they used to, but we're making a lot of money. There was no inflation, tremendous growth. And the big story was how Donald Trump called the economy correctly, and 22 Nobel Prize winners in economics didn't. They got it totally wrong. They got it really wrong. And then just 4 days ago, an unfortunate ruling from the United States Supreme Court. It just came down. It came down. Very unfortunate ruling. But the good news is that almost all countries and corporations want to keep the deal that they already made, right, Scott? Knowing that the legal power that I, as president, have to make a new deal could be far worse for them, and therefore they will continue to work along the same successful path that we had negotiated before the Supreme Court's unfortunate involvement. So despite the disappointing ruling, these powerful country-saving, it's saving our country, the kind of money we're taking in, peace-protecting. Many of the wars I settled was because of the threat of tariffs. I wouldn't have been able to settle them without. Will remain in place under fully approved and tested alternative legal statutes. And they have been tested for a long time. They're a little more complex, but they're actually probably better, leading to a solution that will be even stronger than before. Congressional action will not be necessary. It's already time-tested and approved. And as time goes by, I believe the tariffs paid for by foreign countries will, like in the past, substantially replace the modern-day system of income tax, taking a great financial burden off the people that I love.
These tariffs are being sold to American workers right now as economic patriotism. You're told this is about standing up to China, standing up to globalization, bringing jobs home. But according to new reporting from NPR, what's actually happening is much simpler and much more familiar. Prices are going up, and working people are paying for it. Here's the part politicians never say out loud. Tariffs are taxes, not on foreign governments, not on multinational corporations, on imports entering the U.S., paid by American companies first, and then passed directly on to consumers. So when politicians brag about being tough on trade, what they're often doing is quietly imposing a consumption tax that hits working people, everybody living paycheck to paycheck. And corporations, they adapt just fine. They raise prices, protect profit margins, and blame inflation on policy uncertainty. And somehow executives still collect bonuses while workers are told sacrifice is patriotic. Now, in theory, tariffs could protect American labor if they were paired with massive public investment, strong industrial planning, union job guarantees, and domestic production requirements. But that's not what's happening. What we're seeing instead is nationalism without labor policy. Corporate America isn't suddenly rebuilding factories in Ohio or upstate New York out of civic pride. Companies are still importing goods because it's cheaper. And when tariffs raise costs, they don't eat the loss, they pass it on. So workers get hit twice. First at the store where prices rise, then on the job where businesses freeze hiring, cut hours, or delay expansion because costs are unstable. And here's the uncomfortable truth nobody in either party wants to confront. You cannot tariff your way out of decades of corporate offshoring. Globalization didn't happen because foreign workers cheated. It happened because American corporations chased cheap labor, weaker regulations, and higher profits, and policymakers let them do it. Tariffs without worker power don't reverse that system, they just redistribute the pain downward. If the goal were genuinely pro-worker economics, the conversation wouldn't stop at tariffs. It would include sectoral bargaining, public ownership in strategic industries, union-led manufacturing policy, and again, guaranteed health care so employers can't outsource jobs just to escape benefit costs. Because the real competitive disadvantage for American workers isn't China. It's a corporate system that treats labor as disposable while socializing risk onto the public. So what we're watching now isn't economic populism. It's cost of living nationalism, where politicians talk about protecting workers while policies quietly raise household expenses and leave corporate power untouched. And until trade policy is tied directly to labor power, not corporate profitability, working people will keep hearing the same promise every election cycle. This time, the pain will be worth it. And somehow, it never is.
The golden age of America is upon us. The revolution that began in 1776 has not ended. It still continues because the flame of liberty and independence still burns in the heart of every American patriot. And our future will be bigger, better, brighter, bolder, and more glorious than ever before. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
According to Politico, the status quo of the midterm campaign does not favor the GOP. Trump is on the defensive on many of the issues driving the election cycle so far. That did not change. In some ways, this was Trump's finest. It was a full patriotic projection, said GOP strategist Matthew Bartlett, who served in Trump's first administration. It was aspirational, emotive. Yet in terms of a political speech, there was no policy prescription that will guide Republicans towards safer ground in the midterms. Another Republican operative, granted anonymity to discuss the president's performance, expressed concern that the speech didn't do enough to look forward. It's all look behind, as great as it all is, the operative said. I wish we had more detailed steps to take, directing Congress to do more for people who are hurting. Let's get on to what does have a real impact. A recent report from the Economic Policy Institute. Workers' resolve drives increasing unionization in 2025. So headline numbers first. In 2025, 16.5 million workers in the U.S. were represented by a union. That's not just a small bump, that's an increase of about 463,000 workers from 2024, and it's the highest number of union-represented workers we've seen in 16 years. In terms of share, or union density, that works out to 11.2% of all wage and salary workers, up from 11.1% the year before. Now, 11.2% might sound modest, but remember, for decades the story has been downward drift, so even a tenth of a percentage point increase is a real break from the long slide. And this is happening with a hostile policy environment and a labor law system that the researchers flat out describe as broken. Under the hood, the picture is pretty different depending on where you look. Public sector workers are still way more likely to be unionized. In 2025, about 36.4% of public sector workers were covered by a union contract, compared with just 6.8% in the private sector. Both went up in 2025, but the public side is still where unions are thickest. Within government, federal workers actually saw a notable jump. Union density went from 29.9% to 31.1%, adding about 40,000 unionized federal workers, even as the Trump administration was cutting federal jobs. State and local government workers also inched up from 37.1% to 37.6%, adding roughly 196,000 unionized workers. In the private sector, coverage increased by about 227,000, nudging the rate from 6.7% to 6.8%. The biggest gains were in healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, and educational services. Classic blue-collar industries like mining, manufacturing, and transportation and utilities actually saw declines. Construction was the big exception with meaningful gains. Geographically, the familiar pattern is still there. Higher unionization in the Northeast and the West. Places like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Hawaii, Washington, Alaska, California, Oregon. Lower rates across much of the South. The Carolinas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Texas. The Midwest is kind of in the middle. But 2025 chipped away at that old map a bit. The South accounted for close to half of all net gains, about 214,000 out of the national increase. So roughly 46% of the total growth in unionized workers happened in the South. That's a big deal. Now, who are today's union workers? The old stereotype of the union member as a white guy in a hard hat is just outdated. In 2025, only about a third, 32%, of unionized workers were non-Hispanic men. Roughly two-thirds, 68%, were women and/or people of color. The gender gap in unionization is tiny, less than 1 percentage point. Men's unionization rose from 11.3% to 11.6%, while women's ticked up from 10.8% to 10.9%. By race and ethnicity, black workers still had the highest unionization rate at 12.7%, compared with 11% for white workers, 10.4% for Asian workers, and 9.9% for Hispanic workers. Age-wise, younger workers are still less likely to be in unions overall, but they're the ones driving a lot of the new growth. In 2025, union coverage among workers under 45 increased by about 428,000, while workers 45 and older saw an increase of only about 35,000. So the new organizing energy is clearly younger. But here's the catch. Even with that surge, the gap between who wants a union and who actually has one is enormous. In 2025, 11.2% of workers were covered by a union contract. But surveys show that about 43% of non-union workers say they would vote for a union at their workplace if they got the chance. If you multiply that 43% by the 132 million wage and salary workers who weren't represented by a union in 2025, you get about 56 million people. So more than 50 million workers wanted union representation but didn't have it. That's the representation gap. Rising unionization, but still a system where the vast majority of people who want a union can't get one. Let's talk about why unions are so popular right now, because the favorability numbers really help explain that huge gap between desire and reality. Since 2021, approval of unions in the U.S. has stayed high. Around 68% of people view unions favorably, according to Gallup. That's basically 2 out of 3 adults. And it's not just one age group or one party. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, majorities in every generation view unions positively. One estimate has young adults, ages 18 to 35, at about 72% favorability. So younger folks are even more pro-union than the average. Politically, unions are most popular among Democrats, around 90% favorable, but independents are solidly supportive too, roughly 69%. Even among Republicans, over 40% approval. On top of that, people aren't just saying unions are nice. They're connecting the dots to the broader economy. Most adults say the decline in union membership is bad for the country, about 60%, and about 62% say it's bad for working people specifically. Among young adults, that view is even stronger. Roughly 69% say declining union density is bad for workers, and that includes majorities of young Republicans and young Democrats. So what are people seeing that makes them this pro-union? Part of it is very concrete economic gains. On average, a worker covered by a union contract earns about 12.8% more in wages than a comparable worker in a non-union workplace. And union power doesn't just help members. Where unions are strong, they tend to pull up wages for non-union workers too. That's the spillover effect. Unions set higher standards that become the norm. Those wage boosts are even bigger for workers who've historically been underpaid. Hispanic workers represented by a union are paid about 16.4% more than their non-union Hispanic peers. For black workers, it's about 12.6% more. Women represented by a union earn roughly 9.8% more than non-union women. So unions are not just raising pay on average, they're narrowing racial and gender wage gaps. And it's not just the paycheck. Unions are associated with safer, healthier workplaces. Union contracts offer secure health insurance, paid sick time, and requirements for safety equipment. Maybe more importantly, they give workers protection so they can actually use those rights, like reporting unsafe conditions without as much fear of retaliation. Retirement is another big piece. More than 9 in 10 unionized workers have access to employer-sponsored retirement plans, and union employers tend to contribute more to those plans than comparable non-union employers. So you got better wages, better benefits, safer workplaces, and more retirement security all bundled together. Now zoom out from the workplace to the community. When you look across states, the places with higher union density also tend to have policies that support broadly shared prosperity and democracy. In high union density states, the average minimum wage is about $13.70, compared with $9.30 in low union density states. Median household incomes are more than $12,000 higher on average in those high union states. On basic standards like paid sick leave, there's a huge difference. More than 70% of the highest union density states have enacted paid sick leave laws, compared with only about 11.8% of the low union density states. On democracy, since 2021, low union density states have passed 44 voter restriction laws. High union density states, just 6 such laws over the same period. And when you look at reproductive freedom, states with protections for abortion rights have an average union density about twice as high as states with restrictions or bans. Now, correlation doesn't prove causation, and the researchers are careful about that, but the pattern is striking. Places with stronger unions tend to have higher wages, better public services, more inclusive voting rules, and stronger protections for basic rights. So it's not hard to see why unions are polling so well. They're not just about one workplace contract. They're tied to a broader vision of a fairer economy and a healthier democracy. So we've got this big appetite for unions and growing organizing on the ground. But at the same time, the Trump administration has been pushing what the researchers describe as the most anti-union agenda in modern history. Let's lay out what that looks like. Since returning to office, President Trump has repeatedly moved to strip federal workers of their collective bargaining rights. That includes canceling federal collective bargaining agreements outright and trying to weaken or sideline the independent agency that's supposed to protect private sector workers' rights to organize and bargain, the NLRB. Taken together, the message is pretty clear. Tilt the playing field toward employers and make it harder for workers to build power. And it's not just about unions specifically. The Economic Policy Institute documents a broad policy agenda that's made life less affordable for workers and eroded economic security. So you've got anti-union moves layered on top of an economic program that already undercuts wages and stability. But unions haven't just taken this lying down. They fought back in court, in Congress, and at the bargaining table. When the administration pushed agencies to fire federal workers, often probationary employees, unions sued. A federal district judge eventually found that the Office of Personnel Management had unlawfully directed mass firings of thousands of workers, and agencies were ordered to fix personnel records. Unions also help win reinstatement for many of those workers. One big example, at the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, where over 90% of the workforce had received layoff notices. Nearly 1,000 workers were fully reinstated in early 2026 after months of union pressure, support from public health experts, and broader advocacy. On the legislative front, unions have been key in moving the Protect America's Workforce Act, a bipartisan bill that would reverse Trump's executive order stripping collective bargaining rights from more than 1 million federal workers. That bill passed the House in December 2025 and is now sitting in the Senate. And while Trump is making things less affordable for workers, unions are negotiating contracts that do the opposite. In Georgia, the Machinists Union won a 4-year contract for John Deere workers that includes at least a 2% general wage increase each year and no increases in insurance premiums over the life of the deal. In Illinois, resident physicians and fellows at the University of Chicago, about 1,000 of them organized with CIR-SEIU Healthcare, won a first contract with a 17% wage increase over the term. And in New York, journalists at the New York Daily News, represented by the News Guild of New York, secured a first contract with salary minimums of $60,000 and additional wage bumps of 6% in the first 6 months. These are concrete examples of unions raising pay and protecting benefits at the exact same time federal policy is trying to weaken labor's hand. So the big question is, How do we close that massive gap between the millions of workers who want a union and the relatively small share who actually have one? The EPI report lays out a policy roadmap. First, restore collective bargaining rights for federal workers. That means the Senate passing the Protect America's Workforce Act, and it also means the president could rescind his own executive orders that took those rights away. Second, strengthen rights in both the private and public sectors by passing the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act, and the Public Service Freedom to Negotiate Act. These bills would make it easier for workers to organize and bargain collectively and harder for employers to retaliate or stall. Third, fix the first contract problem. Right now, the law requires employers and unions to bargain in good faith, but it doesn't require them to actually reach a deal. As a result, many newly formed unions never secure a first contract, even after a year or more. The bipartisan Faster Labor Contracts Act would set up a mediation and binding arbitration process when employers refuse to bargain seriously, helping workers translate a union win into a real contract. States also have a big role to play. They can expand collective bargaining rights to groups that have historically been excluded, like many public sector workers, domestic workers, agricultural workers, and app-based or gig workers. They can repeal so-called right-to-work laws. There are 26 of those on the books right now, which weaken unions by banning security clauses and making it harder to sustain strong organizations. Michigan did this in 2023. Other states could follow. And then there's the day-to-day union-busting shit. One key step is protecting workers from mandatory captive audience meetings, where employers require employees to sit through anti-union or political messaging. 14 states have already passed laws giving workers the right to opt out of those meetings. The NLRB ruled in 2024 that captive audience meetings violate federal labor law, but with the current NLRB General Counsel opposing that decision, state-level protections become even more important. When you put it all together, the story of 2025 is pretty striking. Workers are organizing and winning in the face of a hostile federal agenda. Public support for unions is high. The benefits are clear in both workplaces and communities. And there's a detailed policy blueprint for making it easier to get from "I want a union" to actually having one. Whether we close that gap is ultimately a political choice. We're going to keep following how that plays out in Congress, in state houses, and on the shop floor.
First class service!
First class pay! Are you guys ready to fight for your contract?
Yeah!
Being a letter carrier is hard work. Being a letter carrier in a big city is tough work.
If you didn't sign up for a job where you got to worry about your safety, where you got to wonder whether someone's going to attack you as you're mailing and threatening your life.
I was with the postal business before there was a union. All right. First job that I really had in my life was when I came to Chicago, 19 years old, fresh out of college, and I got a job working at the post office. And it was a great job.
The letter carriers were the first union to endorse me for the United States Senate.
This fight for a fair contract, this is all of our fight. It's not just your fight, and it's your leadership has made sure that all of us know that if you don't get a fair contract, none of us are being treated fairly.
Governor Pritzker making mention of the late Reverend Jesse Jackson.
There's no better way to honor his memory, no better way than to stand together right here, right now, fighting for this fair contract.
That was from a postal workers rally in Chicago this past weekend. Postal workers in cities and towns across the country staged coordinated rallies as part of a nationwide day of action, led primarily by the National Association of Letter Carriers, or NALC, signaling growing militancy ahead of upcoming contract negotiations with the U.S. Postal Service. Demonstrations took place from Chicago and Atlanta to Akron, Savannah, Seattle, Fort Wayne, Missouri, and New York's capital region, with letter carriers delivering a unified message. Workers want a fair contract that addresses wages, staffing shortages, safety risks, and the expanding workload facing modern mail carriers. Across the rallies, workers emphasized that low starting pay and tiered employment systems are driving severe retention problems. Union officials noted that many new hires leave within their first year, contributing to chronic understaffing and inconsistent mail service. In Missouri, carriers warn that staffing shortages are now routine, while organizers in Kansas and Ohio link turnover directly to compensation levels that fail to keep pace with rising workloads and living costs. The protests were explicitly coordinated to build public pressure before national bargaining begins in Washington, D.C., after many carriers expressed frustration with the last contract settlement, which some members felt was imposed despite rank-and-file opposition. Speakers at rallies framed the fight as broader than postal employment itself, arguing that reliable public mail delivery, handling prescriptions, ballots, and Social Security checks, depends on stabilizing the workforce and defending the Postal Service as a public institution rather than allowing privatization pressures to advance. Safety concerns also featured prominently. Letter carriers cited rising assaults and dangerous working conditions, with union advocates backing federal legislation aimed at strengthening penalties for attacks on postal workers and modernizing mail infrastructure. At multiple rallies, workers stressed that long routes, heavy parcel loads, and increased violence risks have transformed what was once considered a stable middle-class job into increasingly precarious labor. These nationwide demonstrations represented one of the most visible waves of postal worker mobilization in recent years, a synchronized show of solidarity designed to shape contract negotiations by mobilizing community support, highlighting staffing and safety crises, and asserting that the future of the country's universal mail system is inseparable from the working conditions of the people who deliver it every day. And about 1,500 people rallied in Albany to push a so far steadfast New York Governor Kathy Hochul to support a tax hike on the wealthiest New Yorkers, a marquee campaign push for New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani and routinely backed by the Democratic majorities in the state Senate and Assembly. But Mamdani wasn't there, and attendance fell well short of what organizers had hoped for as the movement finds itself in a tough spot.
More than 1,000 people rallying in Albany for tax hikes on the wealthy. But all of the chanting that echoed through the wind tunnel that is Washington Avenue outside the state capitol won't do much if progressive lawmakers can't sway a so far disinterested Governor Kathy Hochul. State Senator Jabari Brisport.
Listen to the people, not your corporate donors. They want a share of New York too, not just the 1%.
The enthusiasm is in part to deliver on New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani's push for universal child care. The state Senate and Assembly have signaled they'll need the money to expand upon Hochul's proposal, with concerns not only over its downstate focus.
Really, one of the core issues that we have is the pay that childcare workers receive.
But some of that wind was knocked out of the event by the absence of Mamdani himself. Reports surfaced this month that the mayor decided to skip the event in order to not damage his working relationship with Hochul. His progressive pals gave him a pass.
The mayor supports taxing the rich, and he said that very publicly.
I'm sure that, he had his own calculus that he had to do.
So far, Mamdani and his allies have failed to move the governor as budget negotiations close in. Hochul's budget director Blake Washington said Wednesday that the governor won't approve a tax hike if she doesn't feel the conditions call for it.
She does not see raising taxes as a box-checking exercise. She sees it as something that must only be done when absolutely necessary.
As Hochul prepares to play ball with Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie. Heastie weighed in Wednesday amid threats from Mamdani that he'll raise property taxes in the city if a tax hike isn't approved.
In our one house, we probably will have revenue raises in there, but I think more importantly, property taxes is a non-starter.
Stewart-Cousins this week says the Senate will also push Hochul on taxes.
We will continue to push, as we have done before, for progressive taxation.
Republicans, unsurprisingly, are opposed. Senate Minority Leader Rob Ortt summing up his argument.
We double down on the very thing that is chasing people out of this state already.
Let's stop pretending this is complicated. This is a message that should not be controversial in the richest state and the richest country on earth. Tax the fucking rich. New York is staring at budget gaps. Lawmakers are wringing their hands. We're told there's not enough money for schools, for transit, for housing, for healthcare. Not enough money? There are more millionaires in New York today than before the pandemic. Wall Street profits are booming. CEO pay is obscene. Luxury towers keep going up. Hedge fund managers are buying third and fourth homes. The money exists. It's just sitting at the top. And every time this conversation comes up, we hear the same threat. If you tax them, they'll leave. Leave for where? The Mars colony? Wealth didn't magically appear in their bank accounts. It was generated in an economy built by workers, subway operators, nurses, teachers, warehouse workers, public employees. It was generated using public infrastructure, public courts, public research universities, and publicly educated labor. You don't get to extract wealth from a society and then refuse to reinvest in that society that made it possible. Here's the part they don't want to say out loud. If you don't tax the rich, you still balance the budget. You just do it by cutting services, raising fares, hiking property taxes, or squeezing working families somewhere else. It's never about whether we pay, it's about who pays. And for 40 years, the answer has been not the people at the top. This isn't envy, it's math. When wealth concentrates at historic levels and public systems are starved, the rational response isn't austerity, it's redistribution. Because here's the truth. Extreme wealth doesn't just sit harmlessly in an account. It translates into political power. It buys influence. It shapes policy. And then it writes tax codes that protect itself. Taxing the rich isn't radical. It's defensive. It's how a democracy prevents oligarchy. If New York lawmakers claim there's no money for the working class while refusing to seriously tax concentrated wealth, they're not making an economic decision. They're making a class decision. And working people in Albany just made it clear. We see it. Otherwise, the fight carries on. Kaiser healthcare workers in California and Hawaii returned to work Tuesday, ending a roughly 4-week strike carried out amid prolonged contract talks. Officials with the United Nurses Associations of California, Union of Healthcare Professionals, said in a statement Monday there had been significant movement at the bargaining table, prompting them to call for an end to the strike as of 7 a.m. Tuesday. The nurses' strike began on January 26th. Union officials called it the largest open-ended strike of registered nurses and healthcare professionals in U.S. history. There were no immediate details available about how close the two sides were to reaching an agreement or what issues may have been resolved. Kaiser officials said in a statement that the union has accepted the healthcare system's offer of a 21.5% across-the-board wage increase, calling the development good progress that moves us closer to an agreement. Kaiser officials said the union had been asking for increases of up to 63% over 4 years. Quote, "We made it clear when we presented this 21.5% offer on October 2nd that this was the maximum we could offer and keep care affordable for our members and patients," according to Kaiser. Importantly, the increase is higher than any other healthcare provider in the country. The roughly 31,000 members of the UNAC-UHCP had vowed to stay on strike until a fair contract agreement was reached. UNAC-UHCP members include registered nurses, pharmacists, nurse anesthesiasts, nurse practitioners, midwives, physician assistants, rehab therapists, speech-language pathologists, dietitians, and other specialty healthcare professionals. Quote, "We're striking because Kaiser has committed serious unfair labor practices, and because Kaiser refuses to bargain in good faith over staffing that protects patients, workload standards that stop moral injury, and the respect and dignity that Kaiser caregivers have been denied for far too long," registered nurse Charmaine Morales, president of UNAC-UHCP, said previously. The union filed the ULP charge against Kaiser with the NLRB, alleging the company walked away from the bargaining table in December and attempted to bypass the agreed-upon national bargaining process. The union has been bargaining with Kaiser since last May. Kaiser officials also said Monday, "Our bargaining with UNAC, UHCP, and each of the Alliance of Healthcare Unions continues at local tables. We're continuing to make progress and remain optimistic about reaching contract agreements soon." In further action, most non-tenured track contract professors at New York University overwhelmingly voted late Friday night to authorize a strike after more than a year of stalled negotiations over their first union contract, with union members approving the measure 627 to 67. The vote by Contract Faculty United, United Auto Workers, CFU UAW Local 7902, comes after management stonewalled bargaining, taking a year to respond to standard requests for salary data and offering what members saw as inadequate proposals, including a salary increase that would affect just 9 people in the entire union of nearly 1,000. Elizabeth Fay, a clinical associate professor on the bargaining committee, said, "We are rental tenured faculty, by and large held to similar standards, but we are essentially at-will employees. We want a contract similar to the adjunct contract, and we're pushing for something that looks like an enforceable version of a status quo, and this is treated as a completely unreasonable and ridiculous request." Members hope the strike authorization will force movement on key issues like compensation and job security, noting that most contract workers struggle to afford to live in one of the most expensive cities in the nation. Unit members also connected precarity to academic freedom, with one organizer saying the threat of non-renewal can chill classroom discussion. Administrators responded by asserting their counteroffer would put NYU's unionized contract faculty among the best paid nationally. Sound familiar? And accused the union of risking disruption to students' education to gain leverage. Meanwhile, NYU President Linda Mills cited financial strain and a $71 million deficit when addressing faculty, though available financial statements show the university had $11.6 billion in revenue in 2024 and a $7.4 billion endowment. Wouldn't you know? And out on the railroads, a new comprehensive railway safety bill has been proposed in response to ongoing concerns about railroad safety, highlighted by the devastating East Palestine derailments, reflecting a rare bipartisan alliance aimed at overhauling and strengthening national rail regulation. The legislation, introduced on February 24th, seeks to modernize safety standards through several key reforms, including the mandatory deployment of advanced hotbox detectors to monitor wheel bearings, requiring at least 2 qualified crew members on freight trains, and imposing an upper speed limit of 40 miles per hour for trains carrying hazardous materials. It also accelerates the phase-out deadline for vulnerable DOT 111 tanker cars from 2029 to 2027, increases fines for safety violations up to $10 million, and mandates that railroads report hazardous material shipments to states and federal authorities, improving emergency preparedness and community safety. The proposal advocates integrating real-time monitoring systems using Internet of Things technology to better predict maintenance needs and reduce derailments caused by equipment failure or wear, though industry groups have expressed concern that rigid regulations could lead to higher costs and slower freight movements. Translation: not as much profit to be made by going too damn fast. Supporters, including unions such as the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers and Transport Workers Union, have lauded the bill for its emphasis on worker safety and fair labor standards. According to Rayleigh News, the success of this legislative effort depends heavily on effective enforcement, adequate funding, and technological rollout. Governments and rail companies need to coordinate closely to upgrade existing infrastructure swiftly, train personnel on new safety procedures, and ensure compliance is monitored consistently. As the bill moves through legislative channels, stakeholders will debate the finer points, particularly regarding cost sharing, regulatory oversight, and long-term sustainability of the safety measures. The core goal remains clear: safeguarding human lives, protecting communities, and modernizing America's railroads through innovation and accountability. Can we overstate just how much this is needed? It's 3 years now since the disaster in East Palestine, and residents are still struggling.
Chris Albright. I'm a resident of East Palestine, Ohio. I live a half a mile from where the train derailed. Today is the 3-year anniversary of the derailment. Some of the things I want to talk about right now is I'm very angry. I'm pissed. I'm pissed right now at the response from the country. I'm pissed right now at how many people have forgotten about what happened here. I'm pissed at the fact that everybody thinks we're doing fine, that everybody thinks everything in East Palestine, Ohio is good. It's not. We are still fighting the same battle we were fighting 3 years ago. It's ridiculous. We have been through Democratic presidents. We've been through Republican presidents right now, and nobody is stepping up to help us. Nobody gives a shit about what happened to us in East Palestine. I'm pissed. We've been fighting this battle now for 3 years. 3 years we've been going on about this, and nothing is being done right now. And to anybody who is watching this, step up, talk about it, keep it relevant, bring it up to your state representatives, your congressmen, your anybody who is going to listen. Let them know that we are still not right. We're still not whole. We're still not healthy in East Palestine. Help us. Please help us. I'm so sick of the fight we've been battling. I had to step away for months just for my own mental stability before I got back into the fight again. It's exhausting on us. It's very tiring. It's very hurtful. So please step up. Help us. Keep us in your thoughts. Keep pushing for us. Keep doing anything you can to help us. Anything. I don't care what it is. Send a text out that says, hey, East Palestine is still screwed up. Do that to your friends. That anything helps us. Please help us. Please, for the love of God, help us. We need it. And there's so many different communities around this country right now that I know need the help. I understand everything that's going on right now, but please step up. Please give us a hand. We need it. We really, really need it. Thank you.
That clip courtesy of the Working People podcast. Well, given that Norfolk Southern's top priority was to reopen the tracks and keep the freight and the profit moving after the derailment and chemical detonation that devastated the town, it's only a matter of time before that relentless push does more damage somewhere else. So let's hope these reforms get through. Finally, there's a chart making the rounds among economists right now, and one top economist reportedly calls it the revolution chart, because it shows something that polite economic commentary tries very hard not to say out loud. Corporate America is winning the class war. Corporate profits now consume 15.9% of U.S. GDP, nearly double their early 1980s share, while workers' compensation has followed to 62% of GDP, down from 67%. The gap between what labor produces and what labor receives is now the widest in the post-World War II era, and economists warn this divergence carries an undercurrent of betrayal that threatens social stability itself. Now here's where things get interesting, because inequality isn't just showing up in paychecks, housing costs, or retirement accounts. It's showing up in how society literally defends sanity. A recent analysis in Psychology Today reminds us that modern psychiatry has always been shaped by class bias. Historically, researchers looked at higher rates of mental illness among poor communities and concluded not that poverty was harmful, but that poor people themselves were defective. Social psychiatry repeatedly blamed individual failure instead of unjust social conditions, a tendency that still shapes mental health thinking today. So connect the dots. On one hand, workers are producing more wealth than ever while receiving a shrinking share of it. On the other, institutions tasked with explaining human distress have a long history of interpreting suffering as personal pathology rather than structural exploitation. That's not a coincidence. That's ideological infrastructure. Because when profits rise while wages stagnate, something has to explain why millions of people feel anxious, exhausted, indebted, and hopeless inside an economy officially described as strong. And capitalism's preferred explanation is psychological, not economic. You're burned out, not overworked. You're anxious, not precarious. You're depressed, not economically trapped. The system converts material insecurity into individual diagnosis. The most spending growth since the pandemic has come from the richest 20% of households, while the bottom 80% are basically treading water against inflation. So we now live in two realities: a statistical economy where GDP rises and markets boom, a lived economy where effort no longer guarantees stability. Psychiatry historically encountered the same contradiction. When researchers studied working-class neighborhoods in mid-century America, they documented overcrowded housing, deteriorating environments, and chronic stress, but still framed distress as mental abnormality rather than rational response to material conditions. In other words, society medicalized inequality, and we still do. Think about the political usefulness of that move. If despair is caused by low wages, unaffordable housing, unstable employment, and debt, then the solution is redistribution, labor power, and structural reform. But if despair is caused by flawed individuals, then the solution is therapy apps, mindfulness subscriptions, productivity coaching, and pharmaceuticals, all perfectly compatible with record corporate profits. The economic system creates insecurity and then sells coping mechanisms for surviving it. That's not a mental health policy. That's market expansion. What we're witnessing is a feedback loop between economic inequality and cultural interpretation. Labor's share declines. Social stress rises. Institutions interpret stress as personal dysfunction. Structural causes remain untouched. Profits continue to rise, and eventually people stop believing the story. That's the real danger economists are hinting at when they talk about eroding trust. The problem isn't just inequality, it's the growing realization that the rules are rigged and that society insists on blaming you for losing. When workers sense that the economy extracts from them materially while judging them psychologically, legitimacy collapses. History tells us something uncomfortable here. Periods of extreme profit concentration rarely end through gradual adjustment. They end when the explanation for suffering changes, when people stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Who benefits from this?" Because once distress is understood as a class condition instead of a personal failure, the politics change overnight. And that's why the revolution chart matters. It isn't predicting unrest because people are poor. It's predicting unrest because people increasingly understand that their exhaustion, anxiety, and insecurity are not accidents. They're outcomes. Economic inequality produces psychological strain, but ideological systems that blame individuals for structural harm produce something far more volatile: consciousness. And historically, that's the moment when societies stop managing instability and start reorganizing power itself. Well, that does it for this episode. If you like what you hear, give a rate or review on your favorite podcast app to help me grow. I'm proud to be part of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, with over 200 labor shows you can check out at laborradionetwork.org. This has been the Labor Force Podcast. I'm Mike Strukin. Solidarity, always.